In an Egypt steeped in oppression and pride, Moses rises with unwavering humility and a resolute decision to free his people. Guided by the hand of an almighty God, he prepares to confront a Pharaoh whose heart grows harder each day, refusing to acknowledge the signs heralding an imminent change. Welcome to Biblical Reality. If you delight in exploring the depths of Scripture's stories, be sure to subscribe and join our community. Here begins the narrative of the 10 plagues of Egypt. An epic journey of faith, miracles, and liberation. Amid the desert, God commanded Aaron to meet Moses, whom he had chosen to deliver a message capable of changing the destiny of an enslaved people. Aaron, with reverence and urgency, set out across the arid land until he reunited with his brother, who, despite his insecurities, had accepted the divine mission. United by a higher purpose, the brothers presented themselves before Pharaoh's majestic court, bearing the authority and power of a sovereign God. In the vast palace hall, as the desert's shadows seemed to envelop the space, Moses proclaimed the word of the Lord with a firm and calm voice. Then, in a gesture that would seal his mission, Aaron was instructed to cast his staff to the ground. Before the incredulous eyes of the court, the simple rod transformed into a living serpent, slithering with vigor and precision. Egyptian magicians soon appeared, attempting to replicate the marvel by casting their staffs, which also turned into serpents. However, the divine manifestation reached its climax when Aaron's serpent, demonstrating superior power, decisively advanced and devoured the magician's serpents. The environment filled with astonishment, fear, and confused murmurs. Those present realized that the Lord's hand operated undeniably, surpassing the Egyptians' enchantments. Meanwhile, Pharaoh, with a hardened heart, watched from above, unable to recognize the divine authority threatening his dominion. This pivotal moment not only confirmed the truth of Moses' mission, but also revealed the strength of the heavenly calling, the union of two brothers in a sacred mission to liberate a captive people. With the determination to fulfill the word of the Lord, Moses went to the Nile River, the vital artery that sustained life and prosperity in Egypt. As the dawn painted the sky in reddish tones, Aaron took the staff that symbolized divine authority and stood at the edge of the imposing Nile. With a calm voice, Moses proclaimed in the name of the Most High, "By this sign you shall know that I am the Lord." Following the given instructions, Aaron extended his hand and struck the waters of the river. In an instant, the river, once serene and full of life, began to transform. Its crystal-clear waters turned a deep red, resembling fresh blood, while the fish that swam in its currents died instantly. The Nile, revered by the Egyptians and regarded as sacred, became a channel of death and despair. Not only the river itself, but also all nearby canals, wells, and reservoirs were affected. The water that once gave life had turned into a foul and unusable liquid. The transformation had a devastating impact. The Egyptians faced the anguish of seeing their main source of drinking water turned into blood. The stench filled the air, and the animals, accustomed to drinking at its banks, were left thirsty and disoriented. The scene was so dramatic that panic spread among the people. while the priests and magicians who worshipped the waters of the Nile and the deities associated with them found themselves powerless before such a formidable sign. Even the Egyptian magicians, who had previously attempted to mimic other divine wonders, tried to replicate the miracle. They used their enchantments to turn some water into blood, but their attempt resulted in a partial imitation, unable to match the astonishing effect of the power of the God of Israel. This failure only emphasized the superiority of divine authority over human arts. Pharaoh, witness to such an unusual and devastating event, did not yield to the pleas nor the fear spreading through the court. His heart grew even harder, unwilling to acknowledge the power manifesting before him. Instead of taking steps to remedy the situation, he remained indifferent, allowing the chaos to spread. The transformation of the Nile, beyond unleashing an ecological and sanitary disaster, became a powerful symbol of divine judgment upon an Egypt that refused to release the Israelites. Meanwhile, in the streets and homes, the cries for drinking water and the growing desperation could be felt in every corner. Communities, once accustomed to the Nile's abundance, were forced to dig for underground sources and to plead for a relief that seemed distant. This first calamity not only challenged Pharaoh's ability to maintain control, but also planted in the hearts of the Israelites a renewed hope that at last their cry had been heard by the true God. With the river turned to blood, the atmosphere filled with a mix of awe, terror, and anticipation. It became clear that despite the magician's attempts at imitation and Pharaoh's obstinacy, the Lord's power was manifesting undeniably, announcing that greater judgments were yet to come to bring down Egypt's pride and free his people. After the devastating miracle performed on the Nile, God announced the next judgment upon Egypt. Moses warned Pharaoh that if he refused to free the people of Israel, the entire country would be invaded by frogs, a punishment that would disrupt the land's order and purity. The next morning, in fulfillment of the divine warning, an uncountable mass of frogs emerged from the river and spread throughout Egypt. The frogs invaded houses, palaces, and temples, penetrating every space. They leaped onto beds, appeared in kitchens, emerged inside ovens and vessels, making any daily activity impossible. The constant croaking and the uncontrollable presence of these amphibians caused enormous astonishment and repulsion among the Egyptians, who found themselves powerless before the proliferation. Faced with the ensuing chaos, Egypt's magicians tried to replicate the sign performed by Moses and Aaron, using their own enchantments to bring forth frogs. However, their attempt proved to be just a weak imitation of the divine prodigy. The true magnitude of the plague made it evident that the Lord's power surpassed any art, magic, or human illusion. Pharaoh, witnessing this new calamity, was momentarily shaken. For the first time, even he acknowledged the discomfort the frogs caused throughout the kingdom. In a gesture of apparent humility, he summoned Moses and Aaron, asking them to intercede with the Lord to remove the frogs. He promised that if relief were obtained, he would let the people go. Moses then prayed to the Lord. The Egyptians' cries echoed through the streets and homes as everyone pleaded for the invasion's end. However, as soon as the frogs died and the croaking ceased, bringing brief relief, Pharaoh broke his word again, He hardened his heart once more and refused to free the Israelites. The plague of frogs, more than a punishment, became a symbol of human impotence in the face of divine judgment. It exposed that Pharaoh's pride and the oppression imposed on the chosen people were destined to be broken by the Lord's mighty hand. Without prior warning to Pharaoh, God instructed Moses to have Aaron perform an extraordinary act that would mark the beginning of a new plague. In the heart of the Egyptian land, Aaron extended his hand, took dust from the ground, and, upon striking it with his staff, unleashed an astonishing phenomenon. From the minute particles of earth emerged swarms of lice that quickly spread throughout Egypt, covering humans, animals, and everything around. The infestation was immediate and overwhelming. The lice, small yet relentless, settled on the Egyptian's skin, causing incessant itching, irritation, and a profound sense of impurity. Even the priests, guardians of ritual purity, were not spared from the torment. Daily life was severely disrupted. Homes, workplaces, and temples were plunged into discomfort. Even religious rituals were halted, as contact with the insects rendered any attempt at worship impure. In a desperate attempt to replicate this new marvel, the Egyptian magicians resorted to their enchantments. But for the first time, they failed completely. They couldn't produce even a fraction of the lice generated by Aaron. Faced with this, they acknowledged in astonishment, "This is the finger of God." It was a tacit confession that they were confronting a power far superior to their arts and tricks. Despite the evident pain and widespread revolt among the Egyptians, Pharaoh remained deaf to the people's outcry. His heart, already hardened, became even more inflexible. He refused to listen to Moses or consider the possibility of freeing the Israelites. The plague of lice continued to spread, and the suffering intensified. Yet even in the face of such clear and undeniable signs of the God of Israel's power, the Egyptian leader persisted in his denial. The people's voice became a muffled echo, lost amid the cold silence of royal obstinacy. Thus, this plague became another demonstration that divine authority is absolute, and that the Lord's warnings cannot be ignored without severe consequences. Despite the previous calamities, Pharaoh remained defiant, refusing to release the Israelites. In response, God instructed Moses to return to the king's presence with a new warning. If he did not obey the divine command, Egypt would be struck by an even more distressing plague. That very morning, as the sun rose mercilessly over the land, a dark omen loomed in the air. With a resolute voice, Moses declared that the Lord would send swarms of flies throughout the country. And so it happened. As if emerging from nothing, thousands of flies appeared, filling the skies and descending en masse upon cities, palaces, and temples. Multiplying uncontrollably, these insects invaded every corner, landing on banquet tables, swarming inside homes, and even disturbing the sacred rituals of the priests, who were accustomed to ritual purity, but now stood powerless against the onslaught. The environment was consumed by a deafening buzzing, and a sense of suffocation seemed to engulf the entire nation. Even the Egyptian magicians, who had once mimicked some miracles, failed to reproduce this one. Their inability to contain or reverse the infestation served only to further highlight the supremacy of the God of Israel. As the plague spread, despair and astonishment gripped the population. The stench and unceasing hum created an unbearable atmosphere, prompting many to cry out for deliverance. In a desperate attempt to restore order, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, begging them to plead with the Lord to remove the flies. Moses, with unwavering faith, prayed to God, and slowly the swarms began to vanish, leaving behind an unsettling silence and a land visibly shaken. Yet, as soon as relief took hold, Pharaoh's heart hardened once more. Not even the devastation of his own kingdom was enough to break his stubbornness. The plague of flies did not just humiliate Egypt, it made clear the insurmountable distance between the true power of God and the fragile forces of human magic. Thus, the infestation became a dark omen that divine justice would manifest, regardless of the oppressor's resistance. Tension throughout Egypt reached a new height when, after the previous devastating miracles, God announced an even more severe judgment: the death of the livestock. Moses, in the name of the Lord, warned Pharaoh that if he continued to prevent the Israelites from leaving, the divine hand would strike the Egyptian herds, vital sources of food, wealth, and worship. That morning, a somber atmosphere enveloped the land. Aaron, following the Almighty's instructions, raised his staff once again and proclaimed words of judgment. Immediately, a deadly disease spread among Egypt's livestock. Horses, oxen, camels, sheep, and goats fell dead in great numbers. The collapse was so sudden that the sound of agonizing animals echoed across fields and villages. Accustomed to the abundance of their herds, the Egyptians suddenly found themselves deprived of one of the pillars of their economy. Altars and temples, dedicated to deities associated with cattle, fell silent. Priests and worshippers, powerless, watched the destruction of their offerings. Not even the magicians, who had once tried to replicate previous wonders, could stop the catastrophe sweeping through pastures and stables. Meanwhile, in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, not a single animal died. The chosen people's herds remained untouched, a clear sign of divine protection over those faithful to the Lord. This contrast reinforced the separation between the God of Israel and Egypt's false gods, while also revealing the mercy reserved for those who obey him, even in the face of popular outcry and the loss of such a vital resource. Pharaoh did not yield. His pride and stubbornness only deepened, further hardening his heart. He refused to acknowledge the judgment that had fallen upon his people and land, proving that not even the destruction of his wealth and sustenance was enough to break his resistance. The death of the livestock, beyond being an economic and spiritual disaster, became another mark of divine justice and a clear warning that the deliverer of the Hebrews would not back down in the face of the empire's obstinacy. Following the devastation that struck Egypt's herds, God swiftly sent another painful blow upon the land. With unquestionable authority, the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron to perform a prophetic act that would mark the beginning of a plague of boils. In the heart of the palace, Aaron gathered ashes from a furnace and, according to the divine command, cast them into the air before Pharaoh. Immediately, a strange outbreak began to spread among the Egyptians. Within minutes, men, women, and even children began developing painful sores and swellings across their skin. The boils appeared relentlessly, bringing not only unbearable physical suffering, but also public humiliation. The priests themselves, guardians of ritual purity, were rendered incapable of performing their religious duties, covered in sores. Not even the animals were spared. The plague spread indiscriminately, proving that no living being was beyond the reach of divine judgment. The scene was bleak. Pain was etched into the faces of the afflicted, and despair spread through neighborhoods, palaces, and villages. Authorities, powerless, tried to contain the outbreak, but their efforts were futile. The Egyptian magicians, who had previously replicated some wonders, now could not even stand before Moses, so great was their affliction. Silently, they recognized This was no act of sorcery. It was the hand of the God of Israel. Despite the clear evidence of catastrophe and the intensity of the suffering, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. He refused to yield in the face of his people's pain, ignoring the mounting anguish that loomed like a shadow over his nation. The plague of boils continued to spread, and Egypt sank into agony, marked by visible wounds that symbolized inevitable divine judgment. Amid the outcry and chaos, it became ever more apparent. No human power, no priestly wisdom or magical art could contend with the Lord's sovereignty. It was God himself who led this battle, and he would not be stopped. Faced with Pharaoh's continued stubbornness and refusal to heed God's voice, the Lord decreed an even more severe judgment upon Egypt. Moses, granted authority by the Most High, announced that an unprecedented hailstorm would fall upon the land, devastating crops, animals, and people alike. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, signaling a new day, chaos began. Moses rose before the people and issued the warning. Staff in hand, he urged the Egyptians to shelter their servants, livestock, and harvests, for what was coming would spare no one. Soon, dark clouds covered the sky. An eerie silence fell over the atmosphere, followed by deafening thunderclaps. Then, hail mixed with fire rained down from the heavens, striking the earth with devastating force. It was as if the very wrath of the Lord had taken form. The sound of the hailstones blended with the screams of Egyptians running in panic. Fields were leveled, trees shattered, and crops obliterated. Animals and people caught outdoors were injured or killed under the weight of the storm. Even the buildings, once symbols of Egyptian stability, crumbled under the relentless assault. Priests and magicians, accustomed to interpreting omens and consulting pagan gods, stood paralyzed, unable to understand or respond. They tried in vain to stop the disaster. With each falling stone, it became clearer they were facing a power that no ritual could appease. Even so, Pharaoh was barely moved. Some of his officials, however, began to fear the scale of the punishment and urged him to give in, but the king remained proud, nearly indifferent. The people's cries echoed through the cities, begging for mercy. The hailstorm became not just a physical destruction, but a living symbol of divine justice, a direct response to the oppression inflicted upon the people of Israel. It was impossible not to see. Neither the empire's arrogance nor its gods could stand against the power of the true God. Despite the disasters that had already ravaged the land, Pharaoh persisted in his refusal. In response, the Lord decreed a new calamity, an undeniable milestone in his divine judgment against Egypt. Moses and Aaron, steadfast in their mission, once again appeared before Pharaoh, warning that if he continued to harden his heart, a devastating swarm of locusts would invade the nation. On a morning heavy with tension, Moses announced that the locusts would cover the land, consuming what remained of the crops after the destruction caused by the hail. The threat was clear. The swarms would be so vast that they would erase any hope of sustenance, devouring every leaf, every grain, every trace of vegetation. Egypt's already weakened agricultural economy teetered on the brink of collapse. Fear spread rapidly among the population. The Egyptians, dependent on the fertile banks of the Nile to survive, began to brace for the worst. And it happened. From the edges of the earth, thick clouds of locusts emerged, darkening the sky and covering every inch of soil. Not a single herb remained, no plant survived. Everything was devoured, leaving behind a barren, desolate landscape. The devastation was so deep that Pharaoh's advisors, now gripped by concern, pleaded with him to reconsider. They acknowledged, albeit reluctantly, that this was no act of trickery or magic. It was the direct intervention of the God of Israel. Pharaoh, pressured by catastrophe and the cries of the people, summoned Moses and Aaron, asking them to intercede and end the plague. For a moment, there appeared to be genuine repentance. Yet, as in the previous plagues, as soon as the swarms began to vanish, he once again changed his mind. His heart once more was hardened. The plague of locusts was not merely a natural disaster, it was a visible proclamation that no earthly power could oppose divine judgment. The deliverance of God's people was drawing near, inevitable, unstoppable, decreed by the Lord of heaven and earth. When Pharaoh's obstinacy seemed endless, the Lord announced a punishment that transcended the physical. A total and tangible darkness would envelop all of Egypt. Without any prior warning, Moses declared that by an act of divine judgment, light would abandon the land for 3 consecutive days. And so, that evening, as twilight fell over the nation, a thick, nearly touchable darkness covered every corner of the country. The darkness was absolute. Not even the outlines of houses or the silhouettes of people could be seen. The Egyptians, long accustomed to the sun's brightness, were plunged into a silent and terrifying chaos. On the streets, murmurs turned into fearful whispers. In the heavy gloom, every sound seemed amplified, and fear overtook every heart. Meanwhile, in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, the sun continued to shine. This miraculous contrast was impossible to ignore. The chosen people remained under the Most High's protection. The Egyptian priests, guardians of rites dedicated to the sun and other deities, felt abandoned. Their temples were shrouded in darkness, and the impotence of their gods became evident even to the most devout. The darkness, more than an absence of light, became a symbol of divine judgment, a visible declaration that not even Ra, Egypt's sun god, could resist the God of Israel. For 3 days, the nation remained enveloped in silence and dread, interrupted only by the whispers of a people trying to understand the meaning behind such an event. Even in the face of despair, Pharaoh refused to yield. His heart hardened even further. He could not see, not with his eyes nor with his spirit, the hand of the Almighty working before him. The dense, unrelenting darkness became the final warning. No human power, not even that of a king who considered himself divine, could escape the judgment of the true God. The climax of the divine judgments arrived with the most feared of all the plagues. After repeated refusals and Pharaoh's unyielding obstinacy, God announced that a final sentence would fall upon Egypt: the death of the firstborns throughout the land. Moses, with a solemn voice, delivered sacred instructions to the people of Israel. Each family was to set apart a lamb without blemish, sacrifice it, and mark the doorposts and lintel of their homes with its blood, as a sign of protection. That night, while darkness still ruled the land, the Lord passed through every household. Death descended upon the Egyptians with unrelenting force, striking from the Pharaoh's firstborn, seated on his throne, to the youngest child of the servant girl at the millstone. Cries and wailing echoed through every home. Grief spread like a mantle over Egypt, sealing the fate of a nation that had defied the living God. In contrast, within the dwellings of the Israelites, the blood on the doorframe served as a sign, and no harm touched them. God's people were preserved. The faithfulness and mercy of the Most High were fully revealed. Where there was obedience, there was salvation. Passover was born, a lasting memorial of the deliverance that would come through faith and the blood of the Lamb. The tragedy was so overwhelming that even Pharaoh, broken by grief and loss, finally relented. Still burdened by sorrow, he commanded Moses and the Israelites to leave Egypt. The long-awaited liberation had now become reality. Thus, the death of the firstborn was not only the final blow to a proud empire, it was also the beginning of a new story. The promise of redemption was fulfilled. Passover would be celebrated by generations as a reminder that even in the face of judgment, the Lord offers salvation to those who trust and obey. With the end of the calamities, a space opens for meditation and learning, where the deep lessons of these extraordinary events are revealed. Each plague, from the transformation of the Nile's waters into blood to the dreadful death of the firstborns, was a clear manifestation of the supreme power of the God of Israel, and also a call to humility before his authority. These events symbolize not only judgment upon a proud and oppressive Egypt, they illuminate universal themes that transcend generations: faith, obedience, and the fight against injustice. Pharaoh's obstinacy, which led his people through an unrelenting sequence of disasters, stands in contrast to the protection and promise of redemption reserved for the Israelites, a people who, even in suffering, held on to hope in their liberation. Each plague was a divine response to denial and arrogance, and each judgment affirmed an eternal truth: no human power can resist the will of the Most High. Thus, the story of the 10 plagues becomes a testimony that transcends history, a call to recognize God's sovereignty, to value faithfulness, and to rise against all forms of oppression. This account gave birth to the celebration of Passover, not as a mere ritual, but as a living memory of redemption and deliverance. It reminds us that even amid judgment, divine mercy is always within reach of those who trust in his name. At the end of this astonishing journey through the plagues that transformed Egypt, we are left with a powerful lesson about divine justice and the liberation of the oppressed. Pharaoh's pride was confronted by the unshakable power of a God who does not tolerate injustice, and the Israelites' departure was sealed in each miraculous sign, from the river turned to blood to the bitter sorrow of the firstborn's death. Thank you for watching. If this story of the 10 plagues of Egypt inspired you, subscribe to our channel for more biblical narratives.